Buon pomeriggio a tutti, benvenuti a questo incontro nella giornata inaugurale del 36esimo meeting per l'amicizia tra i popoli, dal titolo di Che è mancanza questa mancanza cuore, che a un tratto ne sei pieno. Ed è molto significativo che questo meeting con questo titolo inizi con due grandi incontri.
Starts with two big meetings. One was the religions are part of the solution, they are not the problem. And this meeting was really connected to everything that we're going to talk about today. Today we're going to deal with the character of Abraham, who is the protagonist of one of the biggest meetings exhibitions, who was created by Father Ignacio Carbajosa, or Nacho, and I will call him Nacho in this lecture, who worked together with Professor Giorgio Buccellati, one of the most important archaeologists in the world. And he actually worked in the places where Abraham lived in Mesopotamia. He has been working there for decades. Places that nowadays are suffering from the violence of an enemy, a religious ideology which is against the hearts of man. Nacho and Giorgio already showed us the fruits of a cooperation between them that started right here at the meeting some years ago, and that today wants to start a new path, a new journey. A journey in which men, even though are dealing with different things in their lives, one is a Bible expert and the other one is an archaeologist, where those two people are sharing interests, curiosities, and they are offering right now today the fruit of this human and cultural friendship. The biggest obstacle for our human path is the carelessness of the self. The first step for a truly human path is fighting this carelessness. This might be obvious, but actually it isn't. We should just see the everyday human void which is present in our life. It was 1995, 20 years ago, and Father Giussani was saying these words. And this judgment describes the context of this meeting, 2015, a provocative context with an even more difficult situation of the human being. We are like facing the biggest challenge of our life, what the Cardinal Ratzinger had described as the fall of ancient certainties. It is the biggest fall, and everybody today can see it, the fall of the self, of a consistent self, a self which is capable to face the reality and the circumstances without dying in it. It's like if we got the radiations by Chernobyl, was saying Father Giussani. The organism is like before from a structural point of view, but actually something has changed. It's like if it's paralyzed. This wasn't any moan or any criticism. It was the awareness that this situation itself, it's a big opportunity because it forces us to put the man at the center, to put the self at the center in his existential condition. That's why the meeting's theme is consistent with the theme of our lecture today, because we are going to deal with the nature of the self. And Pope Francis, in his message for this year's meeting, talked about this theme. He says, the evocative and poetic title chosen as this year's theme is talking about the heart of every one of us. St. Augustine talked about a restless heart, a heart that always wants to be satisfied. The fact that people have desire, that are looking for truth, justice, happiness, love, all of these indicates the feeling of an answer. There is an answer somewhere. The Pope says, life is not an absurd desire. Our lack is not the sign that we are wrong. Not at all. It's the thing that tells us that our nature is made for infinite and endless things. So we're really grateful today for having Ignacio here, that together with Giorgio created this exhibition about Abraham. In the character of Abraham, there are the personal traits of the human being. They appear thanks to the call of the mystery which gives a consciousness to the man. So, you know, the exhibition of Abraham is not something related to archaeology, it's not something related to the past. It's an attempt to give a contribution and to make us think about ourselves in this present, in these hard times. Because today what's at stake is the person. The person is the first step for a population, for history, for a city. As President Mattarella wrote in his message for the meeting, the person is the basis of the community and of the state. His freedom, his value, the integrality of human rights pre-exist, as Article 2 of our Constitution says. All of these starts with Abraham. It's something that goes against our being skeptical and challenges our ideas, because we would think about other ways to change the story of the world. But as Julian Caron wrote on 2014, the Lord always changes our plans, and He challenges our way to look at the things of the reality and understanding what's useful for life, for history, and for our future. Who would have ever chosen a man like Abraham, a simple shepherd, in order to change the world? Who would have imagined that this would have been enough? This is a question that is important for every one of us, and that deals with that lack of seriousness towards the problem of the man in today's world. However, the whole history of the world is clearer if we look at this man from Mesopotamia, Abraham. So, thanks to the words of Professor Buccellati and Father Carbajosa, we are now going to discover this great exhibition on Abraham. And I would like to ask Giorgio if we could if he could show us the theme of the character of Abraham with an hypothesis by Professor Buccellati. He questions the traditional literature about Abraham. Many scholars think of Abraham as an artifice, a literary artifice, an invention, a creation in order to rebuild an idealized past. However, Buccellati, while studying this biblical character, raises some questions concerning this perspective. So the question is, how can we talk about an historical accuracy of Abraham? Or in other words, are there any clues, any suggestion that supports the thesis of the historical accuracy of this man, of this single man who lived so many years ago? The question is really clear, but the answer is not. There are many nuances, and I will try to be simple, and I will try and tell you all the limits and good things of this historic research. So we're talking about Mesopotamia. Let's start with this slide, which shows us Mesopotamia. That's the valley between the two rivers, as you may know. But the people of Mesopotamia didn't use this word. They used the word the country of the four shores of the two rivers, Tigris and Euphrates. The two cities were quoted in the Abraham's tale are Ur and Aran, which are situated in this territory. Look, I've put the Italy map here so that you can get an idea of the extension of the territory. So it was quite a big territory. And we're now looking at the geographical context. There are four main regions, four main climate regions. The dry region in the southeast, so at the right. And then there are two arable regions, the Mediterranean region, for example, and in the center there is the steppe, which is the worst of all the other regions because it's really dry, it's semi-dry, and there is not enough water. And it's too high compared to the rivers, so it's impossible to get the water there. So the fertile half moon is that part in green that you can see on the slide. So let's start by looking at this geography with some images that will provide you with a more tangible idea of physical and human geography of that territory. This is quite important, even though you might think it's excessive, but you will agree with me that it was worth it looking at this. This is an image from the satellite. The gray zone is the arable zone. It's really, really narrow. When you get closer with the plane, you can see these lands, fertile lands. The river is quite big, almost 1 kilometer. And there is also this wall. It's really big and it's really impressive because they occupy all the zone of the Central Valley. When you get closer, there is this middle zone. There is not the water from the channels. And there is a living population here with some tents. In some cases, this wall, this impressive wall, is really close to the river, as you can see in the image. Obviously, it's difficult to get the waters from the river at that point because it's really high. When you go up there and you see around you, you can see the steppe. The steppe doesn't produce anything from as for agriculture. There is almost no vegetation. There are just few trees. And there are the mountains in the center of the landscape. This is not the wall which is visible from the river. These are mountains that you can see from the steppe, from the center of the steppe. The only source of fresh water is represented by some oases. Otherwise, there are only some dwells, only some wells where animals usually drink. And animals also eat the vegetation of the steppe, even though it's same stone, actually they can eat it. And those territories are really rich from that point of view. So this is the situation until the 1000 BC. Then the camels arrived. The human groups living in the steppe are not so many. They live in those tents who are actually isolated. There are not that many, and so there are small familiar groups, but there are some exceptions, which are the oases. The Palmyra oasis is the biggest of them. It's really famous. It dates back to the 3rd millennium BC, and then it developed later on during the Romans. This slide is black. I wanted it to be black because I need to say something about the current situation. Obviously, you are aware of what's happening there. It's a really bad situation, and I'm really sad about it, especially for the killing of Khaled Assam. He was the director of a museum in Palmyra. Maybe you've heard of it in the newspapers recently. I want to talk to you about him because The slides that you've just seen were realized by Marilyn, my wife, and I in August 49 years ago, in 1966. We've stayed in Palmyra for 1 month, and Khaled was already the director of the museum, and he welcomed us for that month, and we managed to visit the steppe and all the territory around it. So I think that you can imagine that after 49 years of friendship and of professional relationship between him and I is really a deep feeling for me, because it was a very long time. This applause was for Khaled. I would like you to observe a minute of silence. This is Khaled, as you can see in the slide. Khaled was really interested in modern or recent history of Palmyra's tribes. He had a manuscript, and he was jotting down the most recent traditions of those tribal groups. And this is a good introduction for the second point of my speech, which is the following: a historic perspective concerning this territory. The Emerites were a population, a nomad population. They are documented in the cuneiform texts, especially between 1700 and 1800 BC. And I will talk to you about them from a particular point of view. The Amorites conquered the steppe, actually. Obviously, there are signs of human presence in the steppe, which date back even in ancient times. But when we look at the Amorites, there is a systemic use of the steppe. Amorites understood that it was possible to use animals, such as sheep or donkeys, for example. They could bring those animals from the river. So the economic development which was possible for them was going to the steppe. The animals could live and drink the water from the wells, and few people could survive there by eating the drinkable water they were taken by the rivers or by the oases such as Palmyra. They are considered nomad invaders. They come from the steppe. However, we don't have any evidence that there was a demographic development in the steppe. So we need to ask ourselves, where did they come from? My answer is the following: they didn't come from the steppe. I think that they were actually coming from the rivers, from the two rivers, and from there they ventured in the steppe in order to bring there their animals. So we can imagine this movement, a movement that goes towards the steppe, and then once in the steppe, they acquire the nomad status. So in the red circle, we indicate their capacity to bring an economic contribution to their society. From the steppe, they went towards other directions. That's why we have some testimonies of them from the cuneiform documents. We can read about the military activities of those tribes, which were headed towards the urban centers, especially towards south, towards the city of Ur, and especially towards north, where there is the city of Aran. As you can see, this is the trajectory which is described in the Genesis book for the path that followed Abraham and that followed his father as well. They were headed towards Haran, and then from Haran, traditions described in the Genesis book talk about a movement, journeys between Iran and the Palestine. So we can look right now at the steppe and considering it as a cultural filter, a new way, in which the urban civilization was considered by the Emerites. The Emerites look at Mesopotamia in a different way. They use like some kind of distance, some kind of physical and cultural and psychological distance. However, in the archaeology and in cuneiform documents, there is a lack of this Emirate attitude towards their native land, towards Mesopotamia. So the interpretation, my interpretation towards the Genesis texts is the following. In the Genesis, there is like an echo of themes such as this pride, a sense of conquest by the Emirate. So let's look at some of the episodes. For example, the Tower of Babel, that it was, according to the Mesopotamian people, was something very important. It wasn't an expression of hubris, while for the Amorites, the Tower of Babel was interpreted as an expression of hubris. The flood, well, the flood makes sense if it happened in the steppe, a flat environment surrounded by mountains. And it doesn't make any sense in Mesopotamia, where there are no mountains. In the Genesis, there is the creation of a human couple. While in the Mesopotamia, the creation is the creation of a city as an institution. So the tribal concept wants the man to be the basis of all the social solidarity, while the territorial solidarity is something specific for Mesopotamian cities. Another aspect is that God created man in his own image, while in Mesopotamia is the opposite. The statues, which are the ones in the temples, for example, the statues portray gods as if they were men. And there is also a rich tradition of artisan workshops which use different high-level techniques in order to create those statues. And this is not the same in the steppe, where the human being is the most important thing. Another type of filter is the following. The word of Abraham is a word without writing. Obviously, I'm not claiming that Amorite were capable of writing. It was a word which might be defined as scribal, in the same way in which we could define our modern word a digital word. We totally depend on the digital dimension, even though very few people can program a computer. And it was the same for Mesopotamian people. They depended on writing. In the steppe, there is no scribal culture. There was no writing. And that's what we see in the tradition of Abraham. And this is the contrary to what happens with Moses. If you read the Genesis and then the Exodus, when you read what happens with Moses, there are the stone tablets written by God with the Ten Commandments. But not only this, because in the beginning, we are told that in the Egypt of Moses, the citizens were controlled by the scribes of the Israelites. And these scribes evaluate the quantity of work and the workers. And they work for the pharaohs. And all of these affects the perception of God. In Abraham's tradition, the durability of the word is the central element. The devotion to God is stressed. And that's why the God of Abraham has no name. He is the personal God of Abraham. With Moses, faith and religiousness are embodied in the scripture. So Moses says that he has the right to know the name of God. It is a different God. He has a more objective reality. He is somehow glorified because somebody can write about him. The interpretation of which Alberto was talking before is that all of these traditions are seen as a nostalgic invention, as an invention which was made at the post-exile era, at the 4th century BC. So something that was written after the exile in Babylonia. Obviously, this interpretation is credible. I mean, an interest in justifying their presence in that territory. However, we cannot say that it was an invention from nowhere with no references to the past. Some of the problems which arise regarding this kind of interpretation are, for example, that there is no clear indication, there is no effort by some scholars who support this hypothesis, there is no evidence of the existence of an intellectual center with an extraordinary capacity of literary creation. So, where do all these coincidences come from? Coincidences with the word of the Amorites. Where do these amazing coincidences come from? Obviously not in Mesopotamia, because Mesopotamia had forgotten the very existence of the Amorites. Obviously, if we believe in a literary artifice, we should consider the existence of a genius, of a satirical genius, because the episodes which are described in the Genesis are really human, but they're not edifying at all. For example, some episodes with Jacob sometimes are embarrassing. So it was impossible that they were the models of their past. Otherwise, we should testify the existence of a satirical genius, but there is no evidence of his existence. We also have to talk about the role of Mesopotamia. Obviously, there is a central role of Mesopotamia, but it is not credible in a time where everybody wanted to forget what happened with Mesopotamia. You remember the terrible verse of the Psalm 137, "Daughter Babylon, happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks." Well, you know, this is not the proper context that helped having a nostalgia towards Mesopotamia. Moreover, it is very important Aran, the center of the High Syrio-Mesopotamia. So the center of all the stories was right in the steppe. So the story of Abraham was something that was somehow a marginal area, something detached from the Mesopotamia. So I prefer the second interpretation, the epic memory, which is kept throughout centuries. Obviously, we can make this comparison. The literary artifice might be compared to the Aeneid, while the hypothesis of the epic memory might be compared to the Iliad. So I think that there are parts of oral memory which survived throughout time. One problem of this interpretation is the time gap and the geographical gap. We have a really wide time gap from the 1800 BC to the 10th century. The answer to this issue is quite too much complicated, so I will not go into details. I will only say that there is a court in Palmyra. This court was very different from the ones of other kingdoms, right in that time from 1500 BC to 1200 BC. So that court might have been the channel for the transmission of this oral memory. It is also impressive that there is no evidence of a monotheistic aspect of Amorite religion. So there is no evidence of the religion of Abraham. However, we can say something about this that concerns also the religious tradition of Abraham. The religiousness of Abraham deals with the personal relationship between Abraham and his God, a God that will become the God of his progeny. In Mesopotamia, at the same time, 1800 BC, there is the development of this notion of a personal God. Everybody had his own personal God, a God with no name. It was like something secret. So everybody was praying his personal God. In Mesopotamia, everyone has his own personal God. And we can say that in the steppe, people leave behind their own personal God and believe in one single God. They have one personal God for everybody. So this evolution, this change towards a monotheistic aspect of religion is present in the Amorite tradition as well. So this supports the hypothesis of a cultural context, the Amorite one, for the traditions of Genesis. However, it cannot support the character of Abraham. So far, I'm not actually answering the question of Alberto, because until now we cannot talk about Abraham. We cannot use specific data. We don't have specific evidence. The exhibition says this as well. We only have some inferences. And with these specific inferences, we can give a more precise answer to Alberto's question. Abraham is a totally marginal figure, totally marginal character. So there isn't any proof, any evidence of him as a character in the documents. But that's okay because he is so so marginal character. So however, it's interesting because we could say that there is no legendary process for Abraham's character. He doesn't become a legend. Abraham is a limited character. And this tells us that maybe there was a real person that, even though was very modest, was very humble, had introduced something new, for example, the idea of the personal God. If you think about that, Abraham is neither described as a proto-Moses character, nor as a proto-David character, or even a proto-Ezra, as we might expect if he actually was a post-exile invention. He's a one-of-a-kind character, and the lack of a final editing, we could say, supports the idea of the reality of a character, of reality of a person who actually lived. There is also another aspect, such a big coherence in the biblical message and a structural coherence of the Bible. The Bible is not a mix of differences from Mesopotamia, a mix of different anecdotes. And this supports the thesis of a single basis for all the further developments, of a single basis that originated this new vision, this coherent vision. It's like a vanishing point for the whole universe of the stories of the Bible. The structural contrast of which I was talking about before can be defined according to the relationship with God as it is presented in the Genesis book. The idea of a living God has a central role in the biblical spirituality. We don't have this title with Abraham, but a living God means that God is unpredictable. And one of the most interesting things about this is that with Abraham, promises start. However, these promises are not maintained. For example, the binding of Isaac and its sacrifice. It's a promise which is not maintained throughout the events. However, they are validated by the permanent connection with the living God. So the important thing is the one who promises, and it's more significant than the promise itself. And this is opposite to the reality of Mesopotamia. I insist on this because it's really important. I talk about the birth of the you. Don Ignacio entitled it The Rise of the Self. I talk about the rise of the you. I say it because the self was present in Mesopotamia. The poem of Gilgamesh represents the value of the discovery of human experience, but what is lacking is the idea of the concept of talking to fate, talking to God as a personal reality. So directly addressing the fate. This you, the existence of the you, entails a dialogue. So a living God, an unpredictable living God, because everything can change in any moment, but this God is loyal. So to conclude with, we should talk about the weakness of the historical dimension, of which I've been talking about. It's important to say that the biblical texts don't talk about myths. They talk about an historical era. So it's a very late time compared to the Mesopotamia. So the Bible does not claim that Abraham is antecedent to Mesopotamian civilization. Actually, it's important to consider these correlations, these coincidences that I was saying before. We cannot provide a specific historical dimension for Abraham. We can only talk about the credibility and the plausibility of this prerequisite of Abraham. So the idea of a person that for some time started a new perception of religion, a new concept of religion and of the relationship with God. So the rise of the self and the rise of the you are two fundamental aspects of the Abraham character. Well, this is what I've studied. It's a weak historical character, and however, it's credible. It's a really credible character. And now Father Ignacio will talk to you about him.
Io ringrazio profondamente.
I'd like to thank Giorgio for his great lecture as a great archaeologist and historic expert. As you could see, he goes into details, analyzing all of the hints that are hidden in the reality, going to amazing conclusions which paved the way for a new path, the plausibility of the figure of Abraham, a man that was situated in a specific time, representing the start of something new in history as we know it. And so instead of claiming something, today it started removing a few obstacles and objections so that what we will be able to see in the exhibition realized by Ignacio will become more plausible. So now I'd like to pose two questions to Ignacio. How, starting from the assumption of Don Giussani, according to which Abraham represents the rise of the self. How did you interpret it, and how we will be able to see this in your exhibition about Abraham? In other words, how the exhibition contributes to the plausibility of this assumption. Thank you. First of all, don't be scared, because I'm not going to talk for 45 minutes as our friend Giorgio has just done. I must say that I personally asked him to show you his studies about this, because I think that they are fundamental for what I'm going to say now. So what you did was really good. So obviously the title of the exhibition might seem provocative. As Giorgio said, the human being had been existing for thousands of years. So how can the self rise with Abraham? So how can we say that it rises around 1800 before Christ? Actually, Giorgio already answered the question, contextualizing the religious aspect of the Mesopotamia society, compared it to the Bible, saying that it was not possible to directly address the fate. Then why does the Bible show us the Abraham character with such an intimate relationship with God, directly addressing the fate? That was what could be defined as the first historical move of fate, the rise of the self, the fate calling up a man from Mesopotamia to call him on to generate the human self as we know it. This is why Don Giussani says the story of the entire world becomes clear in the figure of a man coming from Mesopotamia, Abraham. God chose him to reveal himself to man and to save man who had completely forgotten about God. So this is an amazing relation between the nature and the story of Abraham. My question is, how can an historical event mark the nature of the self? God's intervention in history was necessary so that God could reveal himself. Because God, by entering history, saves man. It is very important to understand that this relation between nature and history is very difficult to conceive for us. As a matter of fact, Kant, Lessing, and other fathers of the European Enlightenment wanted to describe the nature of the self by only using their reason and ignoring an historical faith, Christianity, which they actually belonged to. I'd like to share two quotes with you in this regard. The first one by Lessing, claiming that casual historical truth become the proof of necessary truth of reason. Or, as Kant said in his book, Religion Within the Boundaries of Mere Reason, which speaks for itself, he said that pure religious faith, i.e., myself now using reason, I can realize that there's a creator and that I owe towards him and my brothers. He is the only one that can establish a universal church, for it is the bare rational faith which can be communicated to everyone in order to convince him. By contrast, an historical faith, Christianity or Hebraism, based on merely on facts, can spread its influence no further than the reports relating to the ability of judging their credibility. However, a particular weakness of human nature bears the blame for the fact that this pure faith can never be counted on as much as it presumably deserves, namely, to establish a church on it alone. So, we, the Christians of facts, can achieve a pure religious faith, namely a faith of reason. Father Giussani, who loved reason, identified the revolution brought by Christianity in the world of ideas and recognized the challenge it poses to the modern reason. Only an event, historical event, can make the eye clear and substantial in its constitutive factors. This is a paradox that no philosopher and no theory, sociological or political, can tolerate. That an event, not an analysis, not a recording of sentiments, is the catalyst that enables the factors of our eye to come to the surface with clarity and to arrange themselves before our eyes, before our consciousness, with firm, lasting, and stable clearness. Pope Benedict XVI, in Regensburg, with his address and on other occasions, calls for a broadening of the concept of reason and its use in order to include the possibility of God's intervention in history. As a matter of fact, when talking about the right approach to the scripture, he says, the secularized hermeneutic of sacred scripture is the product of reason's attempt structurally to exclude any possibility that God might enter into our lives and speak to us in human words. Here too, we need to urge a broadening of the scope of reason. In applying methods of historical analysis, no criteria should be adopted which would rule out in advance God's self-disclosure in human history, meaning accepting the possibility of a historical intervention of God in the life of man. It calls for a reason which, in its investigation of the historical elements present in the Bible, is marked by openness and does not reject a priori anything beyond its own terms of reference. Let's now analyze the traits of the real human face as we know them, as we see them in Abraham. The first feature, the self in a relationship. As Giorgio said when talking about the Gilgamesh poem, it would be absurd to say that before Abraham, the human self was not religious. It was indeed. But since it could not directly address the faith, it remained isolated, just like Gilgamesh did. It remained isolated, trying to understand the fate and the predictable universe only through reason. It was a very complicated and isolating task. When the faith started to engage in a dialogue with the self, Abraham's self started to conceive itself as a self in a relationship with the faith that had called him and had assigned a path for him. As for the child with his mom, the human face develops in a relationship. Abraham's call marks the rise of the self. I am in a relationship with you. If Abraham asked himself while walking at now down the path God mysteriously showed him, "Who am I?" he would say to himself, "I am yours." There is no greater definition than this one. Anything else is like lead remaining inside us like an external body. Only this possessive adjective revives us. I am yours. From that moment on, there is a new concept of our religious sense. The heartbeats, Gilgamesh heartbeats, represent the nostalgia of a you that established an historical relationship with his creator. So, not what is this lack, but whose lack is this? Mario Luzi's words. Even Leopold's poetry, far away from Christianity, can be recognized in this tradition because it comes from the Christian tradition. How solitary has my intellect become since you began to take it for your home? It looks like a paradox. Since you made it your home, you entered my life. I have been nostalgia of you. So, this is how the Christian tradition affected the great Leopardi. The second element is responsibility and work. When he called him, God assigned Abraham a task: go, leave your country, leave your house, and go towards the country that I will tell you to. So life gains another object. Work becomes vocation, a task, something to follow. Nothing is useless. Everything is worth it because in a love relationship, nothing is useless. So freedom is represented by the gesture of men because they are the answer to the call of God. And in this way, they become useful. Life becomes simpler. It is not just following something that we cannot reach. It is responding to a responsibility. Third element, just look at the beautiful paintings by Chagall. In the exhibition, you will be able to see them. The third factor of the self becomes protagonist of time and history. In the Mesopotamian religious world, there is a cyclical concept of time where there is no space for news and events. Nature itself, with its cyclical seasons, cultivating the land, life and death, it feels more logical because the religious rituals try and establish the following of the cyclical phases. Only God's intervention is able to interrupt this dynamics and to introduce the first chapter of a history that is going to go on forever, not a cyclical one anymore. As Giorgio said, in the civilian context, the urban revolution and the invention of writing had already marked a linear sense of history. The kings of the empire and the list of the kings were already linear. Anyway, the story of Mesopotamia was always the story of the state city. But when talking about man and his relationship with fate, there was this cyclical concept of time. With the biblical people, it becomes the story of the person. God makes a promise with man, and history is full of meaning and contains a lot of events that are the expression of that promise. So the destiny of man is tied and bound with that promise. Fourth element, the self reveals itself inside a people. By overcoming the difficult circumstances, a new people is created, and the self conceives himself as belonging to a people with which God made a promise. The people represents the relationship between God and Abraham at the moment of his vocation. Leave your country, I will make a great people out of you. And the story of that people, the story of Israel, becomes the salvation for all humanity. However, now we get to a specific moment in the history of Israel when, in order to have a full self with all these elements, we always need a contemporary you. Just think of a child if after a few months his mom disappears. And there was a very painful moment in the story of Israel when that you was crystallized in law. How did the creativity of God revealed itself for these people through incarnation? Incarnation, so not with the law, but through his Son. This is why St. Paul talks about Christ as the real successor of Abraham. He is the man which follows the Father, where all the elements of the self are represented as we saw them. So, how can simple people, pagans, can be successful of Abraham? Because all the people that belong to Christ become successors of Abraham. And this is how the human God reveals himself and how we can recognize him in everyone.
E così
And so, according to your last words in the exhibition, now we're at year 0. But then we get straight to our present in the exhibition, and here you talk about another assumption that this method which created the self with the 4 elements you mentioned: responsibility of work, a self-protagonist of time and story, and a self within its people. Here you say that this method was not only useful for the start of history, for the beginning of history, but that it's true also today, and that today man can use this method in looking for its own human face. So I'd like to ask you how you develop this second part by contextualizing this method in today's world. So in a very concise way. So talking about Abraham can be quite useful now, comparing the present situation with Mesopotamia, because I think that we're experiencing the same confusion as the beginning of the life of Abraham, because at a certain point the most easy things are not easy anymore. To be honest, we should say that from when the face of God began to disappear, then also the face of man began to lose the traits, the features that defined the human character. And so we understand the danger Don Giussani talked about in the middle of the 80s. Dear friends, we live in a time, in a very dangerous time. John Paul II said that the greatest danger for man is not the physical slavery, but the elimination of the possibility to be man. We have chains and we have lost our mobility to be able to live God in our lives. So we feel the temptation to use a strategy of power in order to limit the consequences. It actually is a very useless attempt. However, beware, because we risk eliminating the desires that are hidden in the many attempts to achieve fullness. Instead of following our desire, we're tempted to avoid the wrong path, as if we weren't given desire in order to look for happiness. But what does God do? We feel that if our whole world falls down, also the Christian civilization and the certainty of the faith disappears. But is this the path, the journey that mystery in history embarked on? Since mystery started the fascinating adventure of becoming a friend, accompaniment of men in order for men to find themselves, the method has always remained the same. So what is the method? We see it in Abraham, going towards everybody and everything, and God started by picking one man. You're seeing ground zero here in New York, 9/11, the fall of the Twin Towers. saw the fall of a great building. It shows us how large a distraction might be. And we can compare it with this great image, and we understand how by picking one person a great people can be created. So it's just like started from scratch. We think that this method is absurd. In order to save the world, God calls Abraham, a polytheist from the Mesopotamia, on the outskirts of the emperor. When he picked Abraham, God did not fix all of the reality and history. He started to generate a self, so that with Abraham we start talking about the rise of the self. As a matter of fact, the self reveals itself only in front of a presence that calls him, that attracts him and reawakens us from the calmness in which many times we fall. Saying yes to this God, which is calling us, is the greatest contribution that we can make to our world. Thank you for this. So, in order to face the situation of man in the ancient times and in the present times, Pope Francis, in his message to the meeting, says, God, infinite mystery, looked our nothing and offered the response that everybody is waiting for, even though they do not realize it, while they look for it in success, money, and power, in drugs, trying to fulfill their own temporary desires. Only the initiative of God Creator could fulfill and fill their heart. That is to say, representing all of this. So the journey that we embarked on this afternoon is not over. We will continue it throughout the whole meeting and the whole week, starting from the possibility to visit the exhibition about Abraham, which is amazing, and then through all of the lectures, starting from tomorrow afternoon, when Father Lepori will lead us through the great question of Luzi that we choose for the title of the meeting. Then, when Father Don Julian Carron and Monica Maria Maggioni will discuss about these matters, contextualizing them in the present challenges, talking about how the life of Abraham, that's chosen by God in order to go out to every man on earth, how his life can set an example for us today, facing an historic fall of civilization. So the question is, how is it possible today to follow the method of God in order to revive a self up to the present times? Thank you all and have a good meeting.